of innovation. It's got to make money. It's got to make money. Okay? And one of the problems with innovation is a lot of corporates and people in general talk about creative, new ideas, whiz-bang stuff. Well, new ideas are easy. You get a lot of new ideas all the time. If it doesn't make money, it's not innovation. And that's not just a corporate interpretation, that is the definition used by anyone studying innovation. And anyone looking at how we measure innovation looks at the commercialization of new ideas. And that's a simple definition. Here's a more sophisticated definition, and this is actually used by the OECD. And the OECD for a long time has measured innovation. And what's interesting about this is they capture products and services. They also capture what the chap over here, the young guy, said. I'm going to call you the young guy if you don't mind, because you don't have a name badge, so that's the easiest term. The young guy quite rightly said process change, efficiency, absolutely right. If you can cut the costs of making something, that's innovation. You can sell it more cheaply, you're going to sell more of it. What's interesting in the third part of this is something that there's been quite a lot of research attention and attention by executives more recently, which is actually that innovation is as much about changes in how managers manage, how you organise the work you do, and how the workforce is capable, skilled, trained, developed, and evolves to innovate. So in a sense, you've got three parts of a standard definition here. One is to do with products and services, new products, new services, stuff that sells better, sells more. We've lost about a third of the audience already. New products, new services that sell well in new markets, but also the process side. And the process side applies both to products and services. And then finally, this business model innovation, which is a popular term for talking about how companies reorient their business models in order to innovate better. So we captured some of that. Now what I'm going to come on to talk about, I'm going to have one more slide on sort of definition issues, and then I'm going to talk about how firms innovate in networks between firms, and how firms innovate in networks within firms. Again, looking at the global location of these things. But here's quite a neat sort of final definitional framework, and this is to do with trying to combine four types of innovation. In a sense, we capture product and service, new products, new services. You're either improving the quality or the features or the usability of a product or a service that exists. Incremental innovation particularly looks at just enhancing and developing, making your iPhone faster, clearer picture, better RAM, more apps. That's incremental innovation for an existing product. But similarly, if you look at incremental process innovation, you're talking about quality circles, TQM, the kinds of ways that reducing scrap yield, improving productivity of plants that are manufacturing, so you can lower the cost of the product. So incremental process or product innovation is pretty common. Radical innovation is another term that has been used to describe game changers, new platforms, moving away from one platform to a new platform, either to deliver the product or service or to create an entirely new product or service. And in a sense, one of the issues that is interesting when you start doing research within companies, some companies are good at incremental, some companies are good at radical, relatively few companies are good at both. One of the first studies I ever did, one of the most interesting studies, was I spent a year, this was a pure luxury for researchers, I spent a year looking at Sony and Philips. I compared Sony and Philips in the 1990s in terms of their ability to come up with new multimedia products. And we found out from this research that Sony was one of the best companies ever for doing both radical and incremental. Sony had parts of its organisation that were really good at total quality management and improving the manufacturing processes for making. Not as good as Matsushita, but nearly as good as Matsushita. Sony also had a completely separate organisation. Its design and development teams, based outside Tokyo, were really, really good at coming up with whiz-bang radical new products. Philips was far worse. Philips failed to have a number of organisational mechanisms that bridged the market opportunities and the technological opportunities. Yeah? Philips did its technology stuff in Eindhoven, and its markets were all over the world, and there was a territorial divide, a boundary organisationally between the two. They never brought together what the market wants with what the technology can provide. Sony had a number of organisational mechanisms, and one of my first papers actually describes merchandisers and a number of other mechanisms by which Sony was able to bridge market demand, the customers, what the customers want, and what the technology people, the engineers, the R&D designers could create. So Sony's early success was because it was what we call now in the literature ambidextrous organisations. Ambidexterity, in our terms, is the ability to use your right and your left hand evenly. Ambidextrous organisations can do radical and incremental. One of my first exec programs at Warwick Business School where I worked was with Prudential. Prudential is one of the biggest life insurance companies. And Prudential wanted to come up with one of the first online insurance products called Egg. Now called Egg, now quite well known in the UK. It grew to become the biggest direct online insurance provider. But Prudential, when it thought of this in the 1990s, late 1990s, it was launched in 98. The Prudential found it could not create anything as radical as this in-house. It didn't have the organisational culture, it didn't have the structure to do anything radical. And you can debate whether it was a new product or a new service, or whether it was actually just a new process, i.e. online, of delivering a current insurance service. You can debate that, but at the end of the day, what they had was a company that was really focused on incremental, safe development of existing products. So they actually set up a separate unit, and they hired people from other industry areas, including some from consumer electronics, to enable them to establish a culture that would come up with a whiz-bang new idea and that would underpin the growth of Egg. The second reason for doing this is that actually it protects the brand, because if Egg had gone very wrong, the Prudential brand, and that is a lot of the basis of its value, it's trusted, it's long-term, it's something that people would put their money into, its brand would have been spoiled by a failed initiative. So to separate out the radical driver is sometimes sensible. So this helps us sort of understand a little bit about innovation and the way it connects with organisation. I won't spend too long on this. This is effectively just a kind of representation that shows that much of innovation is about combination. You could argue there's absolutely nothing new in the world, there are just new combinations of things. And that applies to products, services, but also the processes and the ways that you produce products and services. So in a sense, what innovation is about is connecting in a dynamic way your internal assets and capabilities with those of your partners, and that combination has to be done in response to a changing external competitive environment. Yeah? So a lot of literature that you see in the management works around adaptability and variety generation in competitive advantage, to derive competitive advantage in very rapidly changing markets. You can capture that by this need to recombine flexibly in response to the external changes in your competitive environment, which is a sort of principal approach I take to a lot of both my research and my teaching. I won't spend any time at all on this, but just so you know, there are some fairly robust studies that look at how you measure innovation, and those can happen at the micro level and at the macro level. So economists like David Dickinson in the front row here, who's a professor of economics, he and his colleagues have tended in the past to say at the macro level, how is it that different nations manage to innovate at different rates? And there are a range of measures that cover both process and product output and look at R&D in particular. And at the micro level, there are a range of different measures I've used in my research quite a lot. So there is a robustness around this. What I'm going to move on to now, though, because it's a bit more interesting, and again, if we were assuming this was a class of executives, I'm going to look at first large firms and then finish off small firms and try and understand some of their locational innovation challenges. And we're going to start with Apple. Has anybody seen this? Anyone seen this diagram? It was published in The Economist in January 2012. You haven't seen it? Good. I'm glad you haven't seen it. It's nice to surprise people. Something new. We're going to look at Apple first of all. We're going to move on to another framework. And the second framework I'm going to talk about looks at intra-firm innovation. Yeah? How does large multinationals bring together different assets, capabilities, and connect them to innovate? This is a diagram, a case study that starts us thinking about inter-firm innovation. And there are a number of questions strategically for any firm. The first question is, where do you play? Not just geographically, but in the value chain. Okay. What do you do within the firm, and what do you leave to the market? Right? And that's not just something executives thinking about. This was the central question that Oliver Williamson had, who's a Nobel Prize winner in economics. The central question was, why is a firm a firm? Why is it, you use the term hierarchy, and what does a firm do versus a market? And he looked at the boundary between a market, the external, and the firm, the hierarchy. It connects to a super question that Edith Penrose asked, who was one of the leading academics in strategy. Edith Penrose said, why do firms do what they do? It's a great question. It's a great question, not just for academics, a great question for managing executives. And doing some work with Ford, for example, Ford has gone through 3 iterations of owning Visteon. Visteon is one of its largest frontline suppliers, and then selling off Visteon. And each time it does that, it's questioning, should we own the means to make the car components, or should we just allow that to stay in the marketplace and buy the components from Visteon in competition with other suppliers? 3 times. It's changed its mind. It's internalized Visteon and said, we need to own that part of the supply chain because it's part of our value chain. And then new CEO comes in, actually, we just make the cars. Let someone else make the components, we'll use the market, make them compete for price and quality. So companies change their boundaries, offshoring, outsourcing, externalizing versus internalizing. It's a question of what you think your core competences are. Now, Apple is really, really good at this, and this diagram shows, this is actually from a pretty old iPhone, this is the 4S, and it's the 16 gigabyte GSM version, one of the earliest versions, and in a sense what it shows you is on this side which of the companies make components for Apple and where are they based. This is the location issue. And on the other side that is the actual component and the price of the component to the final piece of hardware. What you see here is that $178 is the total cost of all those components that go into making the hardware of the Apple. And what we note then is that that is a proportion of the total $560 that at this time this particular version cost. Yeah? So what you figure out actually, if you add in Foxconn, and you must know Foxconn if you're in Hong Kong or in Taiwan or in Singapore or in China, this is a massive company. Foxconn's margin is also up there. Apple gets $368. $368. It appropriates, to use the economist term, of the value of that piece of hardware, $560. And it's because it does a very limited number of things. It doesn't make anything. And in the next slide, you're going to see what it does do. And it lets others that are based in locations where they gain an advantage. In a lot of these cases, it's cheap labour. But you'll notice some of these components are made in more advanced places where the labour isn't so cheap. Yeah? But these component suppliers are based in places they derive advantage, and Apple leverages that advantage. It doesn't do it, it leaves that to the market. It lets other companies worry about that. Foxconn puts it all together. And you know, we could argue that this business model has allowed Apple to overtake in the past, not too long ago, all of these incumbents, Nokia and others, and become the top company. It didn't make phones. I mean, you don't have to be very old to know that it didn't make phones. And it got into the phone business, and that's the advantage it gets from them. So this is a question of what you do and where you do it. And if we look at what has been called the smiling curve diagram, we can see that Apple does 2 things really. It does the R&D, it does actually particularly design. It's a fantastic design company, and it does marketing. It leaves the low value stuff to all of these others. In fact, Arm Holdings, a very successful British company, who did a lot of chip design or wrist chips for the earlier iPhones, is based in the UK. That's an expensive place to make stuff. That's pretty R&D intensive. But the further down the curve you go, the more you're looking at lower cost components where cheap labour and cheap labour locations is increasingly the issue. So Apple derives, as we said earlier, a very large $380 out of the total $560 for that product by putting itself in one part of the value chain and locationally allowing others to leverage their particular endowment advantages of being in certain places. Now, if we pick up on this story, what we know is that Apple is increasing rapidly its R&D spend. They're expecting to spend $4 billion this year on R&D. That's a 17% increase on last year. And the view is they already believe the iPhone model is starting to get jaded. They're looking for the next whiz-bang thing, so they need to pump up their R&D investment. The second thing we know from plans that Apple's put in place is that it's expanding its R&D location. This is very interesting. So previously it did design and development in a different place than it did marketing. In fact, New York and Los Angeles are quite split. New York is seen as quite a marketing center for brand development, and the Silicon Valley is still seen as a hotspot for development of the hardware and the technology. What's interesting is that already Apple has invested in 4 R&D sites in Israel, Haifa in particular. Israel's a fantastic place for design technology. It's actually opening R&D centers in Taiwan, and that's just about to open. And it's opening a new R&D center in Pudong. So what you see here is not a cheap labour push. This is around actually tapping into the expertise, the higher level expertise, in terms of the component technologies in other parts of the world outside the US, i.e. Apple recognises by combining outputs from Israel, outputs from Pudong, but also from Taiwan, connecting those to the R&D it does in California, it is going to be able to innovate better on the design and the R&D side. It's probably going to keep its brand and marketing over in the US, but for its technology input advantages, it's evolving its location footprint. And in a sense, what we see here is an evolution of the location of innovation for a company like Apple, within the firm as well as external to the firm. Does everyone get that? Does everyone see that? You see how that makes money? Any questions about Apple before I move on? Because I think that's kind of an interesting case, and it's got obviously a hot case study. Everyone's talking about Apple. Anyone interested in understanding that any further? Yeah?
With that widespread in localities and cultural difference, that sort of thing, how do they merge the innovative capability of those persons in different cultures?
So it's a very good question, and I'd say innovative capability is one thing. Coordinating and connecting is a key thing, and the next slide's going to talk a bit about that, but it's a very good question, because the more you fragment your effort geographically, the higher the complexity of your internal value chain, absolutely. And Apple, I've never benchmarked Apple, I've never looked in detail at Apple, but my study of Sony and other companies since has shown that your ability to do that efficiently underpins your ability to innovate better than competitors. So organisational mechanisms, like the merchandiser in Sony, which merchandiser was really a flavour of almost a job rotation, but it was engineers working in marketing and then moving with a project to other parts of the firm so they could connect the functions internally. And if that meant overseas locations, they did that. They became physically almost a network to make products work. Now, I don't know how Apple does it. If anyone knows Apple well, they could tell me, but it would be interesting to know. American companies are some of the worst at this. American companies make the worst multinationals because America is so big. American firms have grown very large, focusing just on the American market. European companies are pretty good because if you're a Swedish firm, you can't grow very big focusing on Sweden. Okay, same for British companies to an extent, but any small advanced country tends to breed some of the best multinationals. Nestle, Unilever, these kinds of firms, pharmaceutical firms, they've had to grow international, and their R&D has to be international. It's a very good question. So this next framework, just to keep going, we'll open up to questions at the end here. This next framework's a really interesting one. It's adapted from a great book, which is an old book now, by Nitin Noria and Sumantra Ghoshal. Sumantra Ghoshal was at London Business School, and they have a book in '97 called The Differentiated Network, which answers kind of this question, which is, how is it that a firm manages a portfolio of knowledge and expertise that's distributed globally, a differentiated network? How does it manage to continually pool of the right kinds of knowledge to combine it to create new products and services? How does it reach that sort of efficiency? And this particular framework, the adapted version, appears in a textbook that I've been working on for many, many years. We're now in our 6th edition with a guy called Alan Rugman, which is the Pearson, Financial Times Pearson Group's international business textbook. And the 2012 most recent version has this in. And this is a nice framework to understand the internal network for innovating. So in a sense, we have a number of typologies. At the top, Centre for Global kinds of innovation processes. This is where you sense the opportunity for innovation at the centre, you respond strategically at the centre, and you implement all over the world. And the case example they give in this is Ericsson. Ericsson makes big telecom systems, and Ericsson, if they're creating a new switching system for telecoms, they effectively have massive R&D centres, huge economies of scale in R&D, big tech, and they have a lot of their people focused on one or two central R&D, because they know exactly if they speed up the switching system, which is a technological challenge, it improves the efficiency of the system. Once they've got that technological solution, they implement it all over the world, because they own telecoms companies all over the world, and they just put the new switching technology into their centres globally, and it improves the efficiency of those telecoms. So that's called Centre for Global. And it's very appropriate for certain types of innovation where there's a clear technological step. Pharmaceutical is a good example. You know, if you've got a cancer drug and it's successful, we all know that cancer is all over the world and everyone wants a solution to it. One or two central R&D labs like GlaxoSmithKline and Stevenage in the UK, you break through, then you can implement globally. It's appropriate for some innovation processes to be what they call Centre for Global. At the opposite end of the spectrum is called Local for Local, where the opportunity for a particular innovation is actually sensed. The sensing takes place somewhere locally. They're allowed to respond locally and they implement locally. The intriguing, quite old-fashioned, outdated example they give in the book is fascinating. So, in Unilever, and they did a lot of studies of Unilever, in Unilever they found that in India, their soap powders were not selling very well. And what was happening is that a lot of people back then, this was back in, you know, a lot of the work was done in the 80s, but a lot of people were putting soap powder in rivers to wash their clothes. And the soap powder would just flow down the river, and you'd be helping people further downriver wash their clothes. And the local Unilever subsidiary said, this is crazy, you know, soap powder doesn't work in India. And the headquarters, which would normally say, actually, well, you're right, but we're going to come up with a solution here, said, okay, why don't you do something about it? So they said, responding to the innovation opportunity and implementing were actually at the local level. They sent over some R&D scientists. They put the what are called surfactant properties of washing powder into soap bars for the first time ever. Not soap bars you use in the bath, but soap bars you use to wash clothes. And for the first time ever, they launched a product that enabled people in any setting, whether it's the river or anything else, to actually wash clothes with a bar of soap. So they sensed the opportunity and they responded to the opportunity, and then they sold the product, and it was very successful in India. And in fact, it became an example of local for global. Okay, so local for local is where you implement it, and it's only relevant as an innovation for the local market. There are peculiarities of the local market. What they actually did was it became popular in Africa, it then became popular in Latin America. Anywhere where people, particularly in rural areas, wash their clothes under very different conditions, a bar of soap made a lot more sense than soap powder. And in that sense, that innovation became a local for global innovation. And finally, what they talk about is what they epitomise as the differentiated network. This is global for global. This is the ideal type of multinational. So you sense the opportunities for innovating anywhere in the world. Large companies from HSBC to Nestle to Motorola, they have individuals globally that understand the local market but also understand the technological opportunities. And anywhere in the world, you should be able to connect people across your global network to bring together market opportunities with technological opportunities to come up with innovations. Locally appropriate innovations, or innovations that actually might flow out to other parts of the world. So the differentiated network, in their view, was the ideal form of connecting geographic innovation to the strategy of the firm. And it's a good book, it's still a good book. 1997, you know, you'd think it was out of date, but they still have some nice frameworks. Any questions? Stop me, interrupt me, please.
Is it related to the cultural or the people's the behavioral orientation? Because you mentioned about local and global.
Yeah.
Somehow you could example of India, it might be with the culture or the way of life.
Yes, I think that's a very good point. And in a sense, poor multinationals, in my view, don't tap into cultural differences that actually enhance their ability to innovate. Because there are different types of creativity, and I think they go with different cultures. And I think previous to this example, Unilever subsidiary, the Indian-based subsidiary, was very frustrated because it always could see innovation opportunities, but headquarters would never allow it to do anything. And companies that are called ethnocentric are the companies that insist that their culture is better. Again, American companies are up there. I think British companies are probably up there too. But these companies believe their way of doing things is better, so they tend to think they're more superior. They're not tapping into the different types of creativity and the different local knowledge and combining it to innovate better. And I think some of the work being done now on the bottom of the pyramid innovation, have you heard of this base of pyramid innovation, by a number of people in the States, which are looking at appropriate innovation initiated in emerging economies, is quite interesting because it connects to the cultural point. Very good point. Let me briefly take you through a few slides that give you a grand overview of the global sort of measures, I guess, of innovation dominance, but we'll then come back to small firms before finishing. And this is just some nice data put together by Booz & Co., the Global Innovation 1000. And what's intriguing here is this is nice to see in the sense that we can get a fairly quick idea of the kinds of companies and the kinds of industry sectors, particularly automotive, particularly healthcare and computers and electronics, the kinds of sectors that dominate as the biggest spenders in innovation, but also the firms that you always see in the top of these lists. So it's interesting from that point of view. There's a kind of warning with this though, and the problem with this I find is that it's based on a very simple set of proxies that don't really represent innovation. Okay? A lot of firms don't spend a lot on formal R&D. In fact, their innovation route isn't through formal R&D. They don't have big R&D divisions. They innovate in the market or they innovate in the plants and they come up with new products consistently, but it's not through formal R&D divisions, and that's all that this captures. But it is interesting to see, in particular, some of the companies here that are ranked as the most innovative companies that actually spend a lot less formally on innovation. So Tesla Motors is an intriguing new entrant with Facebook into this list. Now, in terms of its R&D spending, it's 377th on the list. It's not a big company. It does, however, spend 66% of its revenue on R&D, Tesla. Tesla, if you don't know, is the company trying to come up with the big hybrid electric car. And it's getting a lot of following in the US. It's a US-based company, and it looks like it's come up with something that might finally make the step change in electric cars to have the consumer buy them and for this to take off. So it's a tremendously innovative company, but it's not spending anywhere near the amount of these giants. Secondly, just very briefly, again, I think there's a very interesting map. And this is effectively a national dependency map, which is the right term for it, which in a sense shows that there are a number of countries that spend a huge amount on innovation. And this is through their companies. All right? This is actually based on the top 80 corporate R&D spenders in the world, and what they're looking at is where there are net expenditures in the country versus where corporations from those countries, like Americans, actually are based in places like China and India. So all the black circles are the ones where actually foreign R&D is being done within the country. And what you note immediately is that China and India and all of these countries, the R&D that's going on there is actually dominated by foreign firms based that are either American or European. Okay, so the Rolls-Royces, like in Singapore of this world, or the companies based in Hong Kong or in other parts of Asia, but particularly mainland China, actually the big R&D spenders are foreign firms. They're American-owned or they're European-owned. They're the same companies that we saw listed. And what we've seen in recent years is, just like in the case of Apple, they're doing less and less in their home country. They're actually expanding the location of their R&D, not just because it's cheaper, because they're finding better R&D, better technologies, better insights into innovation. So they're setting up R&D centres in these other parts. So in a sense, what this gives us is a sort of net trade balance for innovation, which is quite interesting. Let me finish off just now with, okay, so final point on that. As you will know, being based here, with the huge mainland China growth on your doorstep, you'll know that China is increasing its own internal R&D spend hugely, and you'll know that. Rest of the world, China, compared to certainly North America, Europe and Japan, massive increase in R&D spending from Chinese firms. Let me jump now to just 2 more slides. We don't want to stretch this out too much, but in a sense I think it's interesting now to jump to the other end of the spectrum. There are tremendously innovative small companies that are also global. A lot of people think about SMEs, small firms, as being entirely local, but actually, certainly in high-tech areas, some of the smallest companies are the most innovative. This is an intriguing company, founded in 2009, and the brag from Ryan Jansen, the CEO and the head, the founder in New York, was that they got a better search engine than Google, and you know the size of Google. Well, this company, SetJam, had 15 people and less than $50,000 when it kicked off, and it came up with a search engine, which what it does is it puts together all TV programs globally. Any TV program that's online, it'll put it together and it'll put it in an index for you and personalize the index. So you can find your own TV programs from anywhere in the world in an indexable format, free and paid for. So it'll break them down into subscription and into free programs and index them. Now I've used this case quite a lot. I've never found anybody in an audience who's ever done this with SetJam. So it's intriguing that they claim, and there's proof in this because Motorola just bought it out in December 2011 and paid a lot of money from it. Undisclosed amount, we don't know how much, but they got bought out for a lot of money. They obviously did find a search engine that was pretty fantastic. The interesting thing from my point of view about this company is that its headquarters was in Silicon Valley, in Silicon Alley, which is in New York. This is interesting change in New York, and it tried to rival the California coast in terms of developing particularly software games stuff, and it had some success in this area. So what was different about this firm is it set up its kind of what we call the R&D headquarters with the programmers and the client-facing, i.e. the media-facing part of the firm in New York. But the actual programming was done in Poland. It's a tiny little company, but multinational. And it was multinational because in Poland, I don't know if you knew this, you get some of the best programmers in the world at the cheapest cost. So it's got one of the youngest populations in Europe. 45% of the population in Poland is 20 to 24-year-olds. And they've got massive levels of higher education and a lot of programmers. 33% of Polish speak 2 foreign languages in addition to English. But they're amongst the cheapest programmers because they're in Eastern Europe. And what SetJam found is that it could set up processes to connect the 2 companies, including a Skype wall. They had a whole wall of their office in New York, which was on permanent Skype across to Poland. Now there's a time difference, but they could actually speak to each other through the Skype wall continually. So the programmers in Warsaw and Poland could, during certain parts of the day, chat to the others in New York. Tiny company, but it had already set up global mechanisms to make sure that they interacted across those 2 small functions and came up with quite an intriguing product. SetJam, I'm assuming, is successful because the Ryan Jansen is setting up other companies on the basis of the money they got from the Motorola buyout. So you don't know performance measures, but you can see it was successful up to a point. Just finally then, this last company is intriguing. Has anybody ever heard of Spreadshirt? Anyone use Spreadshirt? Again, this is a tiny company. This could be argued as an example of a company that is locationless. It doesn't really exist anywhere. And this is an interesting next step, which everybody's aware of, online virtual corporations in a sense. But Spreadshirt's been around for quite a while. And the key innovation question for anyone making t-shirts, I'm told, I'm informed, is that if you can nail one design of a t-shirt that will be bought by the most people, you make the most profit. Okay? The biggest problem is making lots and lots of different designs, each of which only maybe 3 people want to buy. The economies of scale disappear very, very quickly. If you could find one t-shirt colour with a design on it that 90% of the people in the world who buy t-shirts bought, you'd be a billionaire. So the key innovation question is, what is that one design? What is the most popular design? So Spreadshirt was set up on the basis of a competition. And what this group, very small group, did was they started a global competition amongst design houses and companies that already made t-shirts. And they paid a lot of money to the winners of this competition. And the competition was for the best designed t-shirt. And they took hundreds of entrants, and then they put them on a website, and they put them back out to the market, both to the original people who designed them, but also through a range of surveys to customer groups and the marketing parts of other companies, including clothing companies. A massive network effect. And the survey, the second part of the survey, was for people to select their best, most favourite design. Okay? Do you understand? It's called crowdsourcing. Crowdsourcing. And it was crowdsourcing for getting the most popular design. So the design ideas came from outside the firm, because they set up a competition to do it, and the selection of the favourite design t-shirts also came from outside. And once they got the top 5 designs, the company made them and sold them. And they make a huge profit. They made a huge profit because they managed to optimise the design process. Yeah? What they did then was, the second iteration of the company, was they actually then set up the company for designers to set up their virtual shops, to sell their own design. And they got a cut, a commission. So again, Spreadshirt didn't really do much. It doesn't make anything. It outsources the manufacturing. It outsources the design. It outsources the selection of the optimal design. And now what it does is outsources its website so that hundreds of designers over the world who are too small to actually set up shop or don't want to set up a physical retail outlet, people in their living rooms who design t-shirts or put stuff together, they can set up a virtual page on this and they can sell their own t-shirts through Spreadshirt. The final iteration of this is they make now, I think it's something like 30 to 40% of their money through corporate design. So if Apple or Nestle wants to commission a corporate design t-shirt for an event or for a division for their marketing people, Spreadshirt do that for them. Again, the design comes from the company, they outsource the manufacturing and the distribution. So this is a virtual corporation. There's a tiny number of people at its heart. They're simply making a small margin on a very wide range of deals. And they nailed that one innovation question in their sector, which is, what's the best design? If we could find out the best design that most people would buy, massive economies of scale. And they did it using these online crowdsourcing. So in a sense, it's kind of a final example because it's a very small firm that actually leveraged no location. Yeah? Compared to all the other examples, big and small, we've talked about, they're leveraging particular locations that have innovation advantages, combining them to become more innovative. And this firm effectively has no location. It's a virtual firm, but cleverly has managed that networking effect online. Let me stop there because it's the evening and it's a long day, and I hope that was interesting, at least partly. And if you've got questions, I'm very happy to answer them now. If you want to have a discussion about any of these cases, again, very happy to chat further. Yes, please.
One question about the fundamental question about innovation.
Yeah.
That small firm, and if you big firm, you have a lot of resources. That's fine. You have a form of R&D. But for that sort of small, company or corporation, even though they are multinational, okay, but they still got some limited resources, okay. But how do they, stimulate or innovation internally or externally? I would say, because most. Say for example in Hong Kong, 80 to 90% of the company are small, okay, SME.
Yes.
But
yeah.
they are, eager to, having some sort of, mechanism to stimulate the innovation in the innovative process in there.
Yeah. Yeah.
How
Yeah, it's a very good question. Remember that, you know, in most countries, over 90% of firms by number are small firms, but the vast majority of these are retail outlets, hairdressers, you know, regular firms where, to be perfectly honest, innovation is not a big part of what drives revenues. In fact, what drives revenues tends to be related to, for retailers, price and supply chain and location, positioning. Same for hairdressers, probably. But there is a small percentage of companies, and particularly startup companies, where innovation is the lifeblood. And what we don't know is, we know a lot in the academic literature and in the management literature about the success stories, by the fact that they're success stories. For every spreadsheet, there must be hundreds, if not thousands, of failures. And I suggest they failed because they failed to crack the innovation question. And it's not just about creativity. I do believe there's a lot of creative people out there. I think, as we know from startup literature, the literature that looks up startup success, you have to have a combination of creativity, solid business and management experience. You know, somebody who can do the finances, somebody who's going to leverage some venture capital to put in a firm. You may need experienced technical help. You may, you know, programmers and so on. So you need a combination of knowledge and expertise. And there's fairly robust literature that shows this. And it's very difficult to find that combination. So my view is I tend to take an evolutionary approach to this, in the sense that the survivors, the Spreadshirts of this world, you know, the Facebooks of this world, actually are not very representative of the average, but they do have lessons about success for others. But often, luck has a big part to play in that coming together of all these different factors. I have done quite a lot of work, though, with large firms in how they particularly get out of standard routines and become more innovative and creative. So I've worked with Sony, actually, and I've worked with HSBC and Prudential on this, because firms that are that big, IBM is a good one, they get locked into a reliance on a particular area of incremental innovation. And after a while, they lose their ability to do anything radical, anything different. And it's often smaller upstarts that come up with a new model and push them out. You could argue IBM is a survivor as well, because it's been in the business for an awful long time, and it's managed to reinvent itself just enough. So it has just enough creativity, I guess, to survive that. Very good question. Anything else? We're here all week.